Eat Well, Travel Often is sponsored by The Bookhouse, an independent bookstore with a cozy atmosphere where you can browse a plethora of fantastic selections, all while enjoying a delicious hot beverage. The folks at The Bookhouse spend a lot of time curating the books found on their shelves so that patrons of all ages can walk in and find all kinds of exceptional reads. Owner Nadaj Nickel also welcomes in local artists and artisans who display their work in a special gallery space. While you're browsing the Bookhouse's many literary gems, make sure to also check out their ever-changing events calendar, featuring readings from authors, topic discussions, workshops, book club meetings, and more. Whether you're looking for a classic, a bestseller, a hidden treasure, or maybe just a community to join, visit the Bookhouse, located at 281 Essex Street in Millburn, New Jersey, or online at thebookhousemillburn.com. Tell them we said hello.
Welcome to Eat Well, Travel Often, a podcast about the intersection of food, travel, the environment, the mind, body, and spirit. I'm Melissa Goldberg. Food is the lens through which I look at life, where it comes from, how it's cooked, its origin. Food creates a community, and how we connect with each other through food is an expression of who we are. I hope to share with you my passion for food, from everything from book to plate. I'm very excited to be talking with Dan Lipow, the founder and chief forager of the Foraged Feast, otherwise known as Dan, the Mushroom Man. In the 1990s, Dan was a professional photographer based in New York. He worked on assignment around the world, sampling the best restaurants in every city and smuggling home the weirdest ingredients he could find. This culinary journey to find the best quality ingredients led him to start foraging for mushrooms and other wild edibles. In 2016, he started the Foraged Feast to bring local wild and foraged foods to his community. I met Dan when he was just beginning his company. See, in addition to hosting this podcast, I run a food cooperative called the Farm and Fork Society. I work with local farmers to bring seasonal and sustainable produce to my community. I reached out to Dan to add mushrooms to my cooperative. Since opening the Foraged Feast, Dan has been providing my group with some of the best mushrooms around. If you want to see Dan in action, check out a mini documentary I created of Dan foraging. It's posted on my website in the show notes. Also, stay tuned. After my interview with Dan, I talk about an amazing movie called The Fantastic Fungi, all about the world of mushrooms. One final thing before we get to the interview. It would be great if you could subscribe and review Eat Well, Travel Often podcast, especially on Apple Podcasts. This helps others find it and helps me get other great guests to talk with. Mushroom foraging, it must change the way you look at the woods. You walk in the woods, you become aware of all the details that are in the woods. You know, I notice when I walk in the woods, there's infinite beauty. You feel connected to this. Mushrooms are like a key to the woods. So I assume you enjoy strolling in the woods. How did you start doing this?
Well, I definitely enjoy strolling in the woods. I've always enjoyed that. It certainly, growing up, was when I was young, when I was 3, we moved to Connecticut. And pretty quickly, my parents started taking us on walks in the woods. They were from Brooklyn and the Bronx, and so they were excited too about that idea. And my dad had grown up going to far eastern Connecticut, where an uncle had a chicken farm when he was a kid. So he spent some summers there, and his return to that possibility of the outdoors and fields and open space, being from the city, was a big motivator for him moving us there. So for me, that was the beginning. And he was always curious about things that he could nibble on. Like he always had a wandering palate, and we'd be at the beach at the shore in Connecticut, and there'd be the roses, the wild salt roses, and he would pick the rose hips and eat them, and my mom would be like, don't eat that, and he would be like, it's okay, it's full of vitamin C or whatever, and he would nibble on these things. And my sister and I also thought he was crazy at the time.
How did he know they were okay to eat?
I don't know, other than to say that at that point in time, he did know. He probably knew from as a kid being, on that farm, and someone there showed him or something, or he may have learned about it somewhere along the way. He was a pretty educated guy, managed to get a PhD or two. So he, somewhere along the way, his science mind knew a few things, but there's no question that he pushed the limits sometimes and would nibble on things that, in retrospect, I have no idea what he was nibbling on. But those rose hips are totally fine. And they're the same ones that are in your, tea with rose hips, or your, vitamin supplement with rose hips. So those are great. And we pick those when we can.
But you didn't start out as a forager
No.
Out of college. So how did you get
here?
Well,
I grew up loving the woods. I grew up in the woods. I went to some summer camps that were really out. Like I went to an Outward Bound expedition camp where we basically lived in the wild for 2 months, for 2 summers that I did that. So there was between my dad and some of that, I had like a nascent little kernel of foraging in my life, but no mushrooms at that point. It was all more like, rose hips and mint and wild berries that were blueberries and wineberries. So then I became a photographer, and I traveled the world then as a photographer, but also as a foodie. And I really was into food and cooking and eating amazing things. So I would travel the world and come home with all these flavors and all these flavor profiles and all these ingredients. And it was just a nonstop food fest in my life, because in the New York photography world where I was living, it was easy to be food centric. Like every shoot was an excuse to have phenomenal catered food, and you could always play because the clients wanted that too. So you could bring in really cool stuff, and everyone would be like, great, that was part of the culture. So I had this sort of whole career and life that led me into places and into experiences that really expanded my palette.
So you were expanding your palette but also the photography had you look at details and like in foraging, you look at.
There's no question. And I was also a very early digital. I was there for the genesis of the digital revolution in photography. So in college, I was on a team at where I was at college at Brooks Institute in California, where we were working directly with the team at Adobe, who were at the time giving us copies of Beta 1.0 Photoshop. So it was pre-Photoshop. It hadn't even really come out yet. Nobody knew what it was, but we were with it, and we had a direct line to call Adobe every day and tell them what wasn't working. And they would, send us a new disc a few days later by FedEx, and we'd install that one. And there it is. We could do the next thing. But that led me into this whole world of photography and detail, right? And sitting at that point at the computer, you had to scan the film into the computer. And when you scanned film, it made dust on the image. And so the first step was always to take your photo, put it on screen, and clean it, which meant this process of by hand with a mouse or with a Wacom tablet pen, going around the image at a high magnification and cleaning up the spots. So you got really good and fast at like whipping this image across the screen and touching all the little spots, like painting them. Well, that visual acuity, that sort of step of like flashing images rolling past you is exactly what you're talking about. It's what became one of my greatest skills when I started foraging in the woods. And that I'll tell you how I got to that in a minute. But when I started that skill, that ability to like scan, almost like Terminator, to scan and pick out these details, was this crazy thing that I could be on my bike, mountain biking, which was another love, moving along a trail at relatively high speed, having to, watch out for rocks and roots and bumps in the road. But meanwhile, I'd also pick out the mushrooms in the distance.
Because it's funny, I walk in the woods and I scan, and I see mushrooms, but it's just because I happen to fall upon them. It's not like I can scan and put them out. Like you have that ability to scan them and find them.
Right. And that really turns out that that skill that I nurtured for years in photography was definitely a skill that has paid off in terms of my ability to see in the forest and to see the details in the environment, and pick out whether it's a color or a shape or a, whatever that feature of what I'm looking for might be. It's cataloged in my brain, and I have like an instant grab on it.
So what was the aha moment that made you go from photography to foraging?
Living in New York, I had a good friend who did a reverse commute from the city. He was doing sales, and he would drive up into Rockland and into Westchester and sort of, not rural exactly, but also, counties that had a lot of woods. And he was interested in, he got himself interested in mushrooms. And he kept a mushroom book on the seat of his car. And when he would be driving along, he would sometimes stop when he would see stuff and try and identify it. And so one day he paged me, because we still had pagers back then. So I called him back, and he's like, "Are you home?" I'm like, "Yeah." He's like, "I'm driving back to the city and I've got this mushroom and you have to Iron Chef this thing." I'm like, "What?" He's like, "Yeah, you'll see." And he hangs up. So, 40 minutes later, he pulls in, comes to my apartment, and comes marching in with a giant puffball, like a bigger than a volleyball, big white marshmallow of a mushroom. And it's spongy feeling and smells really funky. And I'm like, wow, that's intense. And I'd never seen or heard of it. And he opens the book and we look at it, and it's what is considered one of the foolproof 4 mushrooms in the mushroom world. Like if it's bigger than a softball and it's a solid white mass, and you can look at the characteristics, like 3 or 4 characteristics at that point, and it's solid. There's nothing else on the planet it
That's
can be.
one of the mushrooms that I can identify.
It's awesome. And so I lived in Chelsea at the time in New York, and the Whole Foods had recently opened on 7th Avenue. And so we marched up 7th Avenue holding this big volleyball of a mushroom, and walked into Whole Foods, and the produce manager was like, "Whoa, that's so cool." And the butcher was like, "Wow, that's amazing." And, we went around and we gathered ingredients, came back to my apartment, started cooking, calling friends, and we had this whole Iron Chef event till 4 a.m. with this one mushroom.
How many people did it feed?
Oh, I don't even know. I mean, we kept calling friends to come by and try the next bite, and so people would come and go, and it was a little mini party based around this wacky mushroom. Probably the broth that we made just from the skin of it was incredible, and it was like this magic ingredient that when you spoon broth into a dish you're cooking as a chef, most people have no idea there's broth in that dish, but that note that it adds is really, one of the magic tools that chefs have is they have a pot of broth that they can spill into things to sort of juice them up and add this base of flavor. The flavor of that, I remember just being so stunning. And then I took cubes of it, like 1.5-inch solid cubes that I had cut from the center of this mass, and I split plums, little sugar plums, and I dropped half a plum on top of the cube, and then I wrapped this piece of peppered bacon around that.
Oh my God.
And then roasted it in the oven. And so it all caramelized, and the fat from the bacon got into the mushroom, and the sweet sugars from the plum, caramelized into it all. And it was that bite also was a revelation.
Did you learn to cook like that from doing your photography? And
again, it was the second passion of my life, was this food and cooking thing. So that was sort of happening in a parallel line but because I was traveling and exposed to great restaurants and great food, and sometimes food shoots and great, chefs, and I'd photograph a great chef for the cover of a cookbook, and we'd shoot a few dishes that day too along the way. So they'd be cooking, and I was learning from many sources at that point, but
it was your eye. So that was your aha. That
puffball triggered this acknowledgement that there was way more out there than I was aware of. Now, as I said, I'm traveling the world and New York, and finding ingredients and going to what were the best shops in the city at the time to get something great to cook for dinner, right? So now and I had also at that time, right around then, had also gotten my first whole pig from a farm.
What year was this?
This is in the late 90s.
Okay.
So,
Because that wasn't a thing back then to go get a whole hog.
well, it was for me.
For you, yes. But now it's like people go buy, half a cow. But it wasn't then.
Right. And that happened on a photo shoot as well, the whole hog. I was photographing for Rodale Press for an herb encyclopedia. And so I was going to Well Sweep Farms, which is out in Hackettstown, New Jersey. And I see, I now know who they are in a whole different context. But then for a year, every month, we would go out on this photo shoot to that farm to shoot for the Herb Encyclopedia. Me, the art director, a few other, a team. And Cy, the old guy there who ran this incredible herb farm, they grow 2,000 herbs there. And he was just the most amazing font of knowledge. And so I was really jazzed by that because he would send me home with cool herbs. And then one day we're sitting there, it's lunch, we're having our lunch on the patio. He's cooking up some pork chops for him and his wife to have for lunch on the grill right next to us. And she goes, "What you gonna do about them pigs, Cy?" And Cy goes, "Oh, gotta sell those pigs." And I look at the art director and he raises an eyebrow at me and I go, "How much is a pig?" And Cy turns around, looks at me and goes, $225, $250. I'm like, "How much does a pig weigh?" And he goes, $225, $250. And my art director looks at me and whispers, "I'll take a ham and a couple of chops." I said, "We'll take the pig." So that was the first pig. And he, so around the same time, that's how extreme my food life was. Living in New York, little apartment. Turned out that pig ended up in my freezer, my sister-in-law's freezer, both my wife and my parents' freezers, as well as the art director's freezer. That's how far we had to spread the pig.
That's so funny.
It was awesome. But so then this mushroom came into life. And then I was like, this was just expanding around me at that point. And I got a couple books myself on mushrooms, and the internet was a baby. So there were a few things from a few really great mycologists at some universities who they had a little bit online. But at that point, it was really book knowledge, and I went on some forays and learned from some workshops. But I started hunting mushrooms while I was out hiking and biking and doing that stuff.
So before we get into mushrooms, can you just, what is a mushroom? Can you describe, what is
Sure.
it?
So there's the misconception among a lot of people that mushrooms are plants, right? Let's start there. There's plants and there's animals and there's fungi as the three of the main kingdoms of life. There are others, obviously, but those three are the ones that most pertain to us in terms of our interactions with sort of the life of the planet that we can see. And so, but fungi are this whole kingdom, and it turns out that they have totally different rules. They're not a plant, they're not an animal, they share characteristics of both, and they interact with both in a lot of ways at a cellular level, at a nutrient level, at a symbiotic level, at a decay level. There's all of this exists, but the mushroom that whether it's just the simple button mushroom, whether it's the giant puffball mushroom, whether it's a chanterelle or a morel mushroom, those are all just the fruit, the fruiting body, the reproductive spore-producing, and spores being the equivalent of the reproductive, seed of a mushroom. They are the sporing body. So what you're seeing when you see them is just the flower, just the fruit. You're not actually seeing the mushroom body. That exists underground, it exists in the tree bark, it exists, depending on which mushroom and where it's living and growing, it's this hidden web of what's called a mycelial network. And it's thin strands of matter that are, the actual body of the mushroom and the mushroom host. And it just, depending on its characteristics and what it does, it's in the environment that way. And what we eat generally is not that, but is the flower.
It's just the flower. So, there's people, or there's a term out there that they're mushrooms are the internet or the connected of the underground. They connect all the trees they are plant. When you go out and forage, do you feel like there's a connection there that you
Hugely. Especially now, it depends which mushrooms, right? Because there are, to get a little deeper in the science, there are a few main subclasses of mushrooms. There are saprophytic mushrooms, which are the ones that they basically eat matter. They eat cellulose. They eat whatever it is they eat, whatever their thing to eat is in the environment. They chew it up, essentially. The mycelia that they have run through whatever that is and extract the nutrients and break down the cell structure of the other organism. And then they use that energy to produce fruit, and when the conditions are right, and spread their spore to go do the next version of that. So that's saprophytics. Then there's mycorrhizal. And the mycorrhizals are the ones that are the interconnected web. Because what those do is they spread through the ground and they attach to the roots and the bark of the trees, and they go tree to tree, and they can be massive organisms covering thousands of acres for one organism. Like in Oregon, the largest organism on the planet right now that we know of is a mushroom body of a honey mushroom that exists in Oregon. And it covers like 2,000 square acres or something. This one body. It's touching every tree. It's touching.
Is it an edible mushroom or is it
The honey mushroom is edible with caution. But yes, it is edible. There are people who don't tolerate it well. There are some lookalikes that make it not a beginner mushroom. But yeah, the honey mushroom is a good mushroom. So those are the mycorrhizals. And so when you talk about a web, like mushrooms don't photosynthesize, right? The body of them actually lives mostly underground and in the dark. Exposed to light, it tends to die. So it's the fruiting body that pops out that can handle being in the sun, but not too much, because then they dry and shrivel and die themselves. Although they may need the heat of the sun in the right amount and the right amount of water for that mushroom underground or in the tree to fruit. So the mushrooms can do things that the plants can't do, and vice versa. So plants from photosynthesis, produce sugars. Mushrooms cannot produce sugars, but they need some. Those kind of mushrooms. So they link to the tree roots, the tree passes them sugars, and they pass micronutrients.
So it's a symbiotic relationship.
Totally symbiotic relationship. The way that really plays out for me is when I'm out hunting mushrooms, walking through a forest. If I'm looking for a certain kind of mushroom, and I know that certain kind of mushroom tends to have a relationship with certain tree species, but not others. So now I'm looking at the trees. And I'm scanning through the forest and saying, there's one of the right trees. Or not just there's one of the right trees, but there's one of the right trees of the right age, big enough to harbor a mature colony of said mushroom. So now I may move toward that tree, knowing that when I get there, I might find the mushroom I'm looking for.
So when you find that mushroom, do you leave some behind? Or is it something, because since there is a relationship, can you take the entire mushroom, or do you feel like
you can? It's a good question. It is often by the time I've gotten to the mushrooms and the mushrooms have come up to the point where you are seeing them and they're pickable, they've already distributed billions of spores. So there's that. There's usually mushrooms that have been damaged by slugs or insects or other animals nibbling on them, so we leave those behind. Meanwhile, they're still sporing. And then there's some that are sort of coming up that are tiny still, but meanwhile we're there and there's a whole crop of them that are in great shape. But I know that this whole secondary flush is coming behind it.
So it doesn't break the web.
It does not break the web to pick a lot of mushrooms off of them at that point, for sure. But you do want to be, like, I don't pick the ones, like I'll consciously leave behind big mature ones that are sort of too far gone, knowing that what I'm doing is leaving behind a sporing body that's just dropping billions of spores.
So there's literally millions of fungi out there, and some of them can kill you if you misidentify them. So how did you learn to identify the edible ones versus the poison ones? How easy is it to identify? Like, what do you look for?
Right. So late 90s, I started this process. And every year I would add a species or two to my knowledge base. That accelerated at a certain point to where I was adding several species a year. But at this point, I've picked and eaten over 50 varieties in New Jersey of mushrooms, which is a pretty large number if you were to compare it to other mushroom pickers that, like me. So how did I get there? It's really about specific knowledge and about, having to have done the research. So for every mushroom I've eaten, it's not like I looked at it and said, oh, that looks like a good one. It's like I had to find out for sure, 100%, that is what I think I had. And not just from one source of research. There's always, in the learning of a mushroom species, especially the more intricate and more detailed and more sort of, iffy ones, you have to really be sure. So it's cross-referencing at least 3 sources at that point.
But visually, like, a mushroom has gills, they have a top. Like, how do you?
Each one is individual. So a chanterelle is a chanterelle. Or a chanterelle is a golden chanterelle and a smooth chanterelle. And there's several different chanterelles. So which chanterelle am I looking at? Could be a question. At a certain point, it doesn't matter. For certain of those chanterelles, there sort of are subdivisions that don't matter to the consumer, but might matter, intellectually. But each one has its own characteristics. So when you go to learn them, it's about taking a mushroom, and use the word key earlier when you were describing that they're the keys to the forest or something. Well, mushrooms are, and in science, when we talk about identification of plants, animals, and fungi, there are what are called scientific keys. These are breakdowns. So you start with, is a mushroom with gills, with pores, with teeth, with, so now which of those categories? Go to the next step. So it's with gills. It's a white mushroom. It's a brown mushroom. It's right. And you start breaking down this key. So in reality, you may be 20 or 40 steps down a chain of keys to get to the specificity that keys you to the exact mushroom you're at.
So for the novice, there's no one key that they
Zero.
can. There's a huge knowledge base that
Goose
you can't
egg.
just go out.
Nothing.
And
if you want to read the Foolproof 4 mushrooms, you could look them up online and read about the Foolproof 4. So you could get those 4.
which are what, like puffball?
Well, it's funny. So you'll actually see slightly different designations because those may change with geography.
Well, around us in New Jersey, the 2 that I can identify 2.
Yeah.
Hen of the Woods and puffball. And that's the only 2 I would go for.
So hen of the woods, puffball, those are often on the list. Chicken of the woods can be on the list. I've seen morels on the list, which makes no sense to me because not that they're hard to identify, but there are more. In reality, there are several false morels.
So there's lookalikes?
Yeah. And I found a couple of them, which is always, great. In fact, one of the things I tell people that is probably interesting to hear is that one of my favorite things is to identify a poisonous mushroom because now it can't hurt me.
That's true.
Right? So it's great to identify an edible, but for every edible, I hope I identify a poisonous because now it's like an inoculation, right? Like I'm now safe from that mushroom. I have gained enough knowledge to either identify a good one or identify a bad one. But now it's identified to me. Specific knowledge in my brain that until I lose my mind is there, right? To whatever degree it is. And as long as I keep that knowledge active, and that means that sometimes, yeah, I think I saw that one before and I ID'd it, but now I have to go back and be a little more sure because maybe it's one that doesn't show up very often, right? So there's one mushroom, fascinating mushroom, that grows on wounds of a tree, and in a lot of ways it looks like it has a big veil and on the stem, which is a feature that some mushrooms have, and it's white. And white mushrooms with veils can be some of the most deadly amanita mushrooms on the planet, like the destroying angel or the death cap. Like,
I'm not looking for those.
but you will see them all the time. So I saw this mushroom on a tree, which is not a place you often see the amanitas, but it had a lot of characteristics of amanita. So I wrote it off as an amanita. And then I wrote it off another time as an amanita. And then I saw it again just this past fall. It's probably only the third time I've ever seen it. And I was with a group of kids leading a little walk at a camp, and we saw it. And I said, oh, I think that's a bad one. And we just looked at it and we walked away. And I was leading 3 or 4 groups that day. So we got back to the base, and in between waiting for the next group, I opened up my phone and I went looking for that mushroom, and I found it. Like suddenly I found the picture of it that was exact. And I looked at it and I read it and I was like, oh my God, this is a really choice, delicious mushroom that looks a lot like an amanita, but isn't. And so we go walking back on the next round. We get to that tree, and what I didn't know when we walked away, the camp director who was walking with us, he knocked that sucker off the tree and stomped on it because he didn't want
The kids.
he was worried about the kids. Meanwhile, we were doing like a loop of walks. Like, why didn't he leave it at least till the end of the loop of walks? So not only did I lose this great mushroom that I could have had a chance to actually try, because it, like I said, it's only 3 times in 20 years I've seen it, but didn't even get to show it to the other kids in a good way. It was this
You
crumpled
wouldn't eat it with a
mess.
footstep on it?
Huh?
You wouldn't eat it with the
I mean,
footstep?
he crushed it into the dirt.
Oh.
There was nothing left. But so it's yes. So, but and that's my brain knowing as much as I know about mushrooms, seeing this one and realizing only now, 20 years later, that because it of how rare it is. Now I'm in the woods a lot. If I don't see it a lot, it's just not there a lot, or it's not in the woods I'm in a lot, right? So. And different woods have different
Well, that's what I'm going to
mushrooms.
say. Let's talk about the woods. Like, what is the best area to forage? What's the best
Depends
climate?
what you're trying to pick.
So, but climate-wise, like mushrooms come out in the rain. Why is that? Like, what's
Well, each different species of mushrooms requires different fruiting conditions. Some things have to do with seasonality. Some are spring, some are summer, some are fall, some are winter. Some like conditions to be dry, some like condition, and then some water triggers them. But if it's too wet through the spring, they might not fruit that summer. So others might. So it's each one has like what it really wants. The same way anything you grow in your garden has different conditions it really wants, or different trees have conditions they really want to be in their primest condition. A mushroom will, in the same way that a tomato plant in low sun in the wrong soil will barely produce fruit, a mushroom living in conditions that season that are not good for it will barely fruit, if at all. So if you have a drought season, you may not get a lot of mushrooms of a lot of kinds, but certain kinds that are not dependent on that drought condition will still fruit.
So, does each region of the U.S. have different mushrooms that come out, or is it just the type of?
Absolutely, there are mushrooms that only exist on the East Coast, on the West Coast, in the plains. There's that. There are mushrooms that exist on the West Coast and fruit in the winter because conditions there and are such that that's the time of year when all the conditions come together and they fruit. So chanterelles fruit in the late fall through the early winter in the Pacific Northwest. Here they fruit starting in June and finishing in September.
So every area. So you can get them different seasons,
In
but
different places.
regions.
or different parts of the world. And some mushrooms will exist in one continent or another. And just as we have invasive plants, we have invasive mushrooms. Mushrooms that have been brought by accident or on purpose from one place to another and then begin to grow there. Now, they may do what plants do too, which is that they kind of morph a little bit, right? The local conditions, the local water, the local soil is going to change that organism. It's still going to be the same genetics, at least for, a period of time until the genetics really switch. But they're the same genetics, but their characteristics might be quite different. But, terroir, the flavor may be different. The thickness of the mushroom might be different. They may look quite different, but be the exact same species. So you have to know locally. And things that there may be lookalikes that don't exist in the same place, but look alike and are different mushrooms, and one could be edible and one could be poisonous, and they're not even the same species, but they could look very, very similar, except one grows on the West Coast and one grows on the East Coast, and never the twain will meet.
Well, we know you love mushrooms for their taste, and everyone has a different taste. But there's people out there like Paul Stamets and Dr. Andrew Weil who tout the health benefits of it. Can you tell us about how they are? And actually, I recently was at a talk with Dr. Weil, and he said you should never eat them raw, that the health benefits come in cooking them. And then you should never eat the button ones that you get in the supermarket, that they're just
right,
no nutritional value or
well, actually, that last statement I may take objection with, but the first statement about cooking them is really true.
Well, actually, he said because the way they're grown, actually.
Okay.
They're grown. It wasn't the type of mushroom. It was the way they were grown.
Right, the way they're grown, right.
Yeah.
Right, because the type of mushroom, the wild version, which we pick here in the summer as well, of button mushrooms, which the Agaricus campestris that we pick, I've picked them close to your house. That mushroom is a great mushroom and certainly is full of protein and nutrients and micronutrients that are, what are its other health benefits? I don't know. But the micronutrients in mushrooms are powerful immune boosting components in general. Like different ones have different levels, but all of them, just by the very nature of the type of organism they are, across the board, sort of have certain characteristics. The same way vegetables have certain things that are just beneficial no matter what, more or less. But like all vegetables have some fiber. All vegetables have some vitamins and minerals, right? All mushrooms have certain components, and a lot of those components are things that boost your immune system or protect from free radicals, or you could choose a whole slew of different characteristics and follow them and look and see. The cooking of mushrooms is important because a lot of those nutrients are locked inside the cells, and the cell structure, and this is why he said you should cook them. The cell structure of mushrooms is made of a chitin substance, and that substance doesn't actually break down in our stomach acid. So until you apply some heat, which causes the bonds of that cell structure to break, you don't break open the kernel of the nutrients in the mushroom, so they're inaccessible to you.
So in terms of flavor, though, let's go with the flavor. Can you describe the flavor profile of some of your favorite mushrooms? Like, let's talk about hen of the woods.
Hen of the woods
it's my favorite.
is woodsy mineral, like really mineral, like it can be metallic. It can be like there's sort of a taste of nickel or copper or, those, like, it's going to sound crazy. Put a penny in your mouth, taste it. Put a nickel in your mouth, especially if you're talking about old currency that was actually made of those metals. And you can taste very specific characteristics. I think hen of the woods, depending on its terroir, can have a lot of these really intense mineral flavors that are really beautiful. So it can have a sweetness. It can have sometimes it can even have a little bitterness. So it depends. But hen of the woods is really a woodsy, earthy mineral.
What about like shiitake?
Shiitake is a very specific flavor, where hen of the woods shares characteristics with a lot of, some characteristics with a bunch of other mushrooms. Shiitake is really a very specific umami bomb. Like it has such it hits a certain part of your palate, like the back sides of your tongue is where shiitake flavor really settles. And then it has a really strong olfactory component. So if you nibble on a little piece of a fresh shiitake, you'll get this incredible flavor on the tip of your tongue, and then in the back of your tongue, this deep wash of this umami. This umami being like the salty, meatiness.
Do you have a favorite?
And then it goes up into your nasal passages. It's really it's like sipping a fine wine. Like tasting a mushroom that way can be like that. Like you can and get this.
And you can definitely tell the difference between. I mean,
between different
like,
mushrooms.
A mushroom is a mushroom, but it's
not even close. Yeah. Do I have a favorite? Is that what the question in the middle of that was? Okay, so there's a mushroom called the beefsteak mushroom, and that's one of my favorites. It looks, when you find it, it looks like a reddish shelf with a slimy top on it that comes off a tree. And when you pull it off and slice it, imagine like a piece of like hamachi sushi, like yellowfin sushi, like has sort of striations in it. It looks like that. And then when you saute it, that slimy cap forms a natural gravy. So all you do is put a little butter in the pan and slices of this mushroom, and you saute it, and maybe a splash of water at a certain point, and a little more butter and a little salt, and that's it.
Is it a rare mushroom? I've never seen it. Or
it's relatively rare in the woods I keep being in. I know of 2 people who have hidden caches where there's a set of woods that they know where they can go into those woods and when in season pick like 20 pounds of this monster, and I love it. It's so good. But
they haven't told you where that is.
It's lemony. It's lemony, like super lemony in flavor and meaty and livery all at once. So it's a really intense mushroom, but that lemoniness takes over. Like you get this really meaty, almost liver-like textury thing that's kind of interesting and cool, and then this lemon takes over in your mouth, and it's just the best sort of citrusy lemony flavor. So that's one of my favorites. Another one is the shaggy mane, which is not necessarily as rare for me, but the window of time in which when it fruits, there's like one day during which it's at pickable stage, and once you pick it, you have 12 hours to cook it, or it basically liquefies and disappears. So
that's just like, oh, I got this great mushroom.
Right,
wait, it's gone.
It's like, I mean, these are alien structures, right? Like that's why there's so much mystique about mushrooms, is because some of them do the craziest things, like just turn to black liquid goo in hours. And meanwhile, if you get it just right, that one, like imagine the best sauteed button mushrooms you ever had, which can be really rich. Like the button mushroom has a beautiful flavor, or the portobello can have a beautiful, beautiful flavor and texture. This mushroom, when you hit it just right, has the most perfect expression of just mushroom. Like and you take a bite and it assails you with mushroom and is just so fine and delicate at the same time.
Well, I have a question about portobello. You mentioned it. It's not one that you forage, right? Is that
the horse mushroom, Agaricus avarensis, is a local mushroom here as well, and that is the mushroom from which we derived the portobello. The Agaricus campestris is the one that we derived the button mushroom, which is now considered its own species, Agaricus bisporus. But really those are, that is a wild mushroom if you know where to go. And both of those fruit here in the late summer, early fall when conditions are right.
And have you found them?
Some years they are everywhere, and other years they are nowhere. This year I found 3 horse mushrooms maybe, and very few decent buttons wild. Last fall there were more. 3 or 4 years ago, there was a good season. There was a year, the first year I identified for myself campestris, believe it or not, was in a town park. And I was out early on a Saturday morning, really early. And I was driving past this field and I stopped. I said, wait a second. I went out in the field. And there were rings, fairy rings, which are a feature that some mushrooms grow in rings. And that's a whole beautiful way you can see them. But this field it was like a big set of soccer and baseball fields. And it was covered in fairy rings. Some of the rings were 2 feet in diameter and others were 25 feet in diameter. And they were rings of mushrooms on the edges of these circles, intersecting, crossing over each other, arcs and arcs of mushrooms all across the field. So I started picking. And the soccer teams came out getting ready to play. It was like a battle against me and them in time to pick the mushrooms or get squashed. But yeah, so they can be like, I mean, you can, if you get lucky, hit it just right and conditions are right, in a big field, there can be 20 pounds of either of those some days.
So you had said, okay, so this crazy beefsteak mushroom, not the beefsteak, the other one that disintegrates.
The shaggy mane.
You can't really store it. Most mushrooms, how do you store them? Like, if you buy them,
So most mushrooms you pick and put them in refrigeration, just refrigeration, 34 to 40, normal, safe refrigeration. They will last for between a couple days and actually a couple weeks for some of them. That one, I think if you got that one quickly, in perfect condition, got it into the fridge at 34 degrees, you might get yourself a whole day in which to cook them.
So you don't see them on like menus or restaurants.
You really don't, like, unless you have me showing up at the back door of a top restaurant and saying, dudes, this is on your chef's pass tonight because that's all you get, use 3 of these per person and they'll come back begging for it for the next 20 years.
So in addition to foraging mushrooms and having your own company foraging, you also lead hikes and teach people on a foray. Is that the name of it?
Yeah, mushroom foray or a foraging walk. I definitely do that. Have done a bunch of that. Am struggling with how to continue that, actually, because I don't just teach about the mushrooms. I teach about plants as well, like whatever's forageable at the time, right?
Well, what else do you forage?
Plants, roots, berries, herbs, everything that it's expanded at this point to be many things in the environment that are, in the different environments I'm in and that have culinary value. Because for me, this is still a culinary journey. It's like, it's a business, but it's also a culinary journey. It's about the quality of flavor that you can't get anywhere else. What's grown in a greenhouse doesn't taste the same. What's grown in a field by a farmer in a monoculture does not taste the same. These things have specific and wonderful characteristics that can easily be bred out of them very quickly if unless you can give them exactly the right conditions, whatever those might be. And they change year to year in terms of their quality, right? So if it's a bad year for chanterelles, they may not taste as good as they did last summer.
It's also a sustainable way to give people great culinary or a taste of something great where you're not destroying the environment you're teaching them about these ways.
Right. But that's where I've run into trouble now, is that I've taken groups out into local woods, in a bunch of local woods being within an hour of here where I live. And I'm starting to see, I started doing that, taking people out maybe 10 years ago that way. it now is apparent that I created a bit of a monster. I feel responsible. Like there are people who I taught who they were interested, but if I hadn't made it possible for them to quickly leap forward in their knowledge, how many of them would have? And it turns out that, one reason we have farming is because to sustain enough of a resource for a mass of people in an environment requires intensive farming. So if we have something that exists in our woods, but it's fragile, and suddenly lots of people know about it, even if they have good intentions, but all of them want a little bit, it may be too much.
So I think that's like ramps, right?
Right. Locally, ramps are really in trouble because they have, for a ramp, when a ramp goes to seed and that seed springs open and drops and falls on the forest floor, and let's say that out of the head of the ramps, 2 or 3 actually take root and start to grow. So those will take 7 years before they can produce their own seeds.
And so people are going in there and taking them all, and then there's no
ramps. So there are 2 patches of ramps in local woods that are gone. And it's my fault. Like, I found them when nobody else was picking them. Like, maybe there was 1 or 2 other people in the entire space that used those woods that had any clue and that also picked a couple ramps every spring. So I would go in, I'd pick 3, 4, 5 pounds of ramps that year for myself and enjoy them. And we would, I'd make pesto and I'd make pastas and we'd have ramp fest for ourselves, whatever it was. But suddenly I'm showing other people, and then they're showing a couple friends. So now they go back in the woods the next year with their best friends for a hike, and they go pick ramps and they come home and they eat them. And now their friend shows and their friend shows, and suddenly it's like.
And also when they don't know what the original size of the patch was.
They don't know the size of the patch, and they don't really understand because they hadn't gotten to it as organically as I did. Like I slowly over years developed this knowledge base, and that's something that's, like I didn't grow up with it. And this, 100 years ago, everybody grew up knowing what their grandparents knew was safe to eat in the woods. Now nobody does.
Right. Well, and I actually heard that during seasons where it's rain and the mushrooms are out, the hospitals get a lot of people who are sick because they go out there and they pick.
2 years ago was an incredible summer for mushrooms. They were everywhere. We had rain almost every 5 days all summer. It was fantastic. But yes, there were the spike in cases of mushroom poisoning that summer were off the chart. And many times that summer, I ran across people in the woods filling bags with mushrooms and having no idea what they were putting in their bags, planning to take them home and maybe figure it out. But I came across a group of students one day, like college students. They each had 2 bags in their hands, and they saw me with a little basket, and I had a few mushrooms in, and they're like, "What are those?" Because there wasn't anything they had, because everything they had was not okay. And I'm like, "Guys, you got to throw those out." They're like, "Well, we're going to check them out when we get home." I'm like, "You got to throw those out. Those are poison." They're like, "Well," and I'm like, "Guys, they're poison, like real poison. Like you will go to the hospital and may need a new liver poison." So yeah, it's not, when in doubt, throw it out is the coda to live by. And it's not a joke. Like, you have to have the knowledge.
Well, and it's funny because I don't have the knowledge, and I do this to you all the time, and I want to know how many people do this. I take a picture of a mushroom and I text you. Does your phone blow up during those times?
Yes, a lot. I know that there was one day where I got, 28 texts from different people that day of mushrooms. That was the worst day I remember, where I actually went back and counted. Like, there may have been other days similar, but yeah, and that's a lot.
It is a lot. I think it was during that rainy year, I was texting you from the woods. Are these hen in the woods or the out there? And I'm like, do I take them? Do I not? And I actually left because I knew they were, but I wanted to make sure.
Right. And that's what you should do. You want to make sure. Like, you may be a mushroom lover, but unless you have the specific knowledge, you're in a dangerous place.
So final question.
And that's true of plants. I want to be really clear about that. Like, people think mushrooms are, because they're sort of more mysterious and they come and go much more quickly and you don't get to see how they grow the way you see how a plant grows, that people think they are much more dangerous. That is a fallacy. There are equally dangerous plants and berries and trees and herbs, and it's just because we're used to the 20 or 30 things in the supermarket that are vegetables, it doesn't mean that plants are safe. I want to be really clear that
I think people do it more with mushrooms. When they go, they don't pick
Well, but even if they did, they're not nearly as fearful of a poisonous plant existing, even though they probably pass more poisonous plants in a day than they pass poisonous mushrooms.
So, final question, because I have to ask this question. Have you ever found a magic mushroom around here?
Lots.
Really? One species? More than one?
More than one. I see a variety of mushrooms that have hallucinogenic components in the forest, on the forest floor. In every season, there are amanitas. There are a few different ones that I'll see fairly regularly.
So how come you haven't shared?
Well, so those are the ones that that when you look back at history and at some of the great literary minds that were playing with the psychedelics in the 18th century, like they were poisoning themselves too, because these are the ones that a little gets you high, a lot damages your liver. And what's the dosing of these wild mushrooms? How's the terroir? What is it doing to affect the mushroom? So those I have never and would never play with. I know too much to consider it even remotely safe. The psilocybin, right, which is there's the class of psilocybins, and those are less likely to do permanent damage to your organs. So that's great. But you never know the potency of those if you're really picking them in the wild, right? And so
I didn't realize there was potency. I thought it was per gram.
Sure, and per species and per environment. So yeah, it's so it's not just a straight. If you're talking about the one psilocybin variety that is grown as the magic mushroom, but there are so many others out there. Now, so the ones that are magic mushrooms in the wild tend to grow in manure. Horse, cow, manure, like that. So people will find them in places where there's lots of those animals. And I had an accident once, a gardening accident, where I took a compost bin and I dumped in a couple of bags of horse manure, stirred them in there, and a month or 2 months later, I came back one day and opened up the compost to dump in a bunch of compost. And the entire surface of this big bin of compost was covered in psilocybin in perfect condition. But this is where it gets complicated. It was at an elementary school where I was maintaining a kindergarten. So my very funny thought was, oh my God, drug-free school zone. And I quickly grabbed a rake and stirred them back into the mix because I didn't want to, play. It was not something I was interested in playing with at the time and figured I better just get rid of.
You hope that one of those little kids didn't find them.
Yeah, we didn't want the kids finding that.
You didn't take them on a hike, did you?
But so I did accidentally grow a beautiful crop of them in that location.
So now you know how to reproduce it.
Well, that would depend on conditions again, being just right. But it's a very easy mushroom to cultivate for those who cultivate it, which is why it's, something that's possible. And it's repeatable. And so if you have a strain that is a known strain produced in known conditions, then it becomes possible to sort of measure the potency and sort of put a number on the potency of it and be able to say, okay, so now when you process this down and you put it in a capsule form so that somebody could take a microdose of a certain amount, you could take a microdose of a certain amount.
So is there how do people find you? Where can they find the mushrooms? You have
Okay, so we, theforagedfeast.com is certainly online, a good place to find us. The Foraged Feast, at The Foraged Feast on Instagram and Facebook, both work. And we do restaurant sales in New Jersey, and we do farmers markets in New Jersey. So Summit, Montclair, Denville. This summer I believe we're going to be at Sparta every other week. We were at Metuchen in the past. That may not continue. And Ramsey is another market that we may be in on a monthly basis this summer.
Do you plan to expand out of New Jersey, or right now just
I
New
definitely
Jersey?
plan to expand. I'm looking right now at what my next steps are to sort of grow this business to the next level. So I think the first step to that is probably, doubling, tripling the restaurant sales, and also upping our market presence. For the kind of product and specialty I certainly need markets that are robust in terms of foot traffic, as well as in communities where there's sort of an acceptance of what this product is. And I also need people who selling for me who understand the product and can describe and describe and make it accessible to those people. So it tends to be a more well-to-do customer base that have experienced in their own culinary worlds these kind of flavors and are then looking for them to use them and have the time and the money to do it. So it is a gourmet product. It's not that I want to keep it that way, but it's a hard-fought resource at the same time. So, it's not something that you can give away. Like if you don't have resources and you live in a place where you're in the outdoor world and you can go pick them, you can have virtually no income and have some of the best food on earth. But if you live in a food desert in Newark, your chances of getting your hands on this stuff are just non-existent, unfortunately.
Right. Well, thank you. You know that I love your mushrooms.
Well, thank you.
And try to eat them as much as possible. But thank you for taking the time.
We'll make sure you get some today.
And thank you.
You bet.
And
thank
eat
you.
well and travel often.
That's it.
And now we are at the Book to Plate segment of Eat Well, Travel Often podcast. Here, I report back to you my personal experience. It could be a cookbook I cook from, a restaurant I ate at, even a place I recently visited. If you have any suggestions, please reach out to me. I love mushrooms, and Dan has opened my eyes to the world of the amazing taste of mushrooms, but there is so much more to them than just a source of food. I've recently learned about the power of mushrooms from a documentary called The Fantastic Fungi. I have now seen the movie 3 times. I hosted 2 screenings in my community because I thought it was important to get it out there. After both screenings, I moderated a panel that included Dan Lipow to talk about foraging and the importance of the mycelium network, and also Kai Buller, who hosts a podcast called Psychedelics Todays, and Matt Emmer of Field Trip Health, who is currently conducting research in Jamaica on psilocybin and soon will be opening clinics in New York, LA, and Toronto. The film is visually amazing. Using time-lapse footage, the movie opens your eyes to the more than 1.5 million species of fungi, including yeast, molds, mushrooms, all over this world. The movie is directed by Louis Schwarzenberg and written by Mark Monroe, who won the Best Documentary Oscar for The Cove, which, if you have not seen yet, I highly recommend seeing The Cove. Fantastic Fungi tells the story of the importance that fungi and mushrooms play as the digestive force and the internet of the plant world. The documentary includes interviews with one of my favorite authors, Michael Pollan, alternative medicine doctor Andrew Weil, in addition to those who are currently studying the role that magic mushrooms, psilocybin, can play in helping with mental illness and addiction. The movie spends a good portion of time interviewing mycologist Paul Stamets, who examines the importance of fungi and mycelium in addition to scientists from Johns Hopkins and other facilities that are doing clinical trials. The psychedelic magic mushroom gets a lot of attention in this movie, which has gotten a lot of mainstream attention recently because of Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, which I also highly recommend. I actually listened to it, and it's narrated by Michael Pollan, which I felt was amazing because it was coming from his voice. Anyway, although the recent attention, there has been a quiet emergence of the medical power of psychedelics with renewed research, which got a bad rap when Nixon rescheduled LSD and psilocybin as a political tactic. The recent medical studies have revealed that psychedelics can help in today's mental illness crisis. From saving the earth and saving our minds, mushrooms and fungi have an important role to play in our future. The movie is screening all over the world, and I highly recommend to take 2 hours out of your day to see it. A special thanks to Dan Lipow of the Foraged Feast for sharing his foraging journey with me. If you want to find out more about Dan and his company, you can go to eatwelltraveloften.net, where you can find all the show notes. You can reach me via email at melissa@eatwelltraveloften.net or on Instagram or Facebook at eatwelltraveloften podcast. I would love to hear any comments or recommendations you have. And as always, eat well and travel often.